Well, good morning, Salthouse. Happy Epiphany. Epiphany is a fun story, right? We're going to hear it in a minute, but I bet a lot of you already know it. This is the story where the Magi bring gifts to Jesus. And in prepping for this sermon, Pastor Ryan warned me that a lot of people like to give pastors Bible-themed gifts, but I should probably expect more frankincense and myrrh than gold over the years. But if you're unfamiliar with this word epiphany, it comes from the Greek word epiphania, which means manifestation. So at times when God reveals God's self in the Bible, it's referred to as an epiphany. One of the earliest examples is the burning bush with Moses, and then God also appears to the prophets, and ultimately as Jesus. So we use this word colloquially all the time, right? Like, have you ever said, I had an epiphany? You're basically saying, and then God appeared. In the liturgical church calendar, Epiphany is January 6th, which is the day after the 12th day of Christmas. It's usually observed by Western churches on either the Sunday before or after the 6th. It celebrates the revelation of Jesus to the entire world. And in Western churches, so for Catholics and Protestants, we use this story of the Magi. We're going to hear it read for us now from Matthew's Gospel by Sean Mobley.
Matthew chapter 2, verses 1 through 12. After Jesus was born in Bethlehem in Judea, during the time of King Herod, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem and asked, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews? We saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." When King Herod heard this, he was disturbed, and all Jerusalem with him. When he called together all the people's chief priests and teachers of the law, he asked them where the Messiah was to be born. "In Bethlehem, in Judea," they replied, "for this is what the prophet has written. But you, Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will shepherd my people of Israel." Then Herod called the Magi secretly and found out from them the exact time the star had appeared. He sent them to Bethlehem and said, "Go and search carefully for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." After they heard the king, they went on their way. And the star they had seen when it rose went ahead of them until it stopped over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they were overjoyed. On coming to the house, they saw the child with his mother Mary, and they bowed down and worshipped him. Then they opened their treasures and presented him with gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route.
Isn't this just the romantic climax to the Christmas story that we all know? I mean, let's think about it for a second. Imagine, if you will, Bethlehem. Mary and Joseph have just tucked baby Jesus into the hay. The sheep and the cattle are lulling. The shepherds have stopped their dancing and are in awe of the scene. The angels have stopped singing. The night is quiet. And then, all of a sudden, the jingling of bells can be heard. Everyone sort of turns to see what the noise is, and these large, looming shadows emerge from the alleys of Bethlehem. Monstrous camels step into flickering light of the barn, and on the backs of each, a king. 3 of them. They dismount, each dressed in flowing robes of ruby red, emerald green, and cabernet purple. Their crowns are made of the most precious metals and studded with the most elusive gemstones. They practically touch the ceiling, they're so tall. And their beards are full and long, showing their wisdom and distinction. They smell of exotic oils and far-off lands. And just when Joseph is about to ask what they are doing, they suddenly drop to their knees and bow. Everyone in the room gets goosebumps as these clearly powerful men acknowledge the universal authority of this baby. And as if their humility wasn't enough, they go on to shower the infant with gifts like no one has ever seen. Gifts of gold, a symbol of royalty. Gifts of frankincense, a symbol of priesthood. And gifts of myrrh, a symbol of death. That last one makes everyone tense a little, but Mary, she smiles. She's not sure what it all means, but she has faith that it will all work out. And somewhere in the corner, an angel strums one last melody on a harp while the fire flickers out on this tableau scene. I mean, that's the scene as we know it, right? That's the Renaissance painting. That's the animated Bible movie. It's the front yard nativity scene. And it's all beautiful, and it's really sweet, and it fills us with tidings of comfort and joy. But all of it ignores one glaringly obvious thing. When we look at the actual story of the Magi, the story that Sean just read for us, that story is tremendously violent. This cute story about foreign travelers paying homage to baby Jesus, it's nestled in the middle of a story about a king trying to kill Jesus by slaughtering all of the babies in the region. When we stick to the romantic version of the Magi, there's this temptation to believe that now that God has arrived, everything will be different. But when we give into the temptation of that belief, we're then shocked by the violence, political tension, apathy, and oppression that are still all around us. Instead, violence is front and center in the story of the Magi. Queer Bible scholar David Garland says the story of the Magi is a text of terror, for no one sings in Matthew's infancy narrative as they do in Luke's. Instead, they weep. Where Luke's gospel gives us these away-in-a-manger images of dancing shepherds and singing angels, Matthew's gospel gives us political posturing, empire building, and oppression of the most vulnerable. And this story of the Magi is a story for our time. It's daring us to recognize that God is with the vulnerable. And once we recognize that, we see that the empire isn't going to protect us. We have to do things differently. As the story says, we have to return by a different route. But the writer of Matthew is an evangelist. He tells this story of violence not for the sake of despair, but for hope. So let's reimagine the story for a minute. Imagine, if you will, the Magi. Whoever they are, perhaps they're kings, perhaps they're priests, perhaps they're magicians, but whoever they are and wherever they come from, they start out in their homeland. Maybe they live together in some sort of palace or tower or monastery. Maybe they don't even know each other. But each live in separate, far-flung corners of the world. And at dusk one night, they each stare out at the colors of the setting sun, and they squint their eyes, and they see a star. It's just barely visible in the twilight, somewhere between the sun's rays and the moon's beams, and it's a new star. They've never noticed it before. And whatever tradition they've studied, whatever their school or belief may be, they recognize that this rising star is a sign from Yahweh, the God of the Jews. So they obey. They pack up and go, which is such a powerful thing in the Bible. All of the faithful get up and go. And they travel across the desert. They have to believe they are a part of something amazing. So they travel to a foreign town, and when they arrive, it's filled with exotic scents and new foods and a hustle and bustle that is both familiar and foreign to them. And they know they're looking for a king, so they go to the king, King Herod. They do something very logical, but all of a sudden, everything changes. Because what they don't know is they just tipped off the empire, and the empire becomes paranoid. But they don't know that yet. All they know is that Herod called together the priests confirmed what the Magi say, the empire's friendly, likable enough, and gives them the information they need. And they go to Bethlehem to find this incarnate God. And what do they find? A baby. And maybe they get it, maybe they don't. Maybe there's like this moment of hesitation where they're like, gold bullion for a baby. But this is the journey they came on. This is the God they came to see. And the story ends with this single line. And having been warned in a dream not to go back to Herod, they returned to their country by another route. And at some point, they put two and two together. The empire is powerful. The empire is power hungry. It's paranoid, and it's going to kill the babies. And this God they came to see is a baby. And suddenly, they haven't arrived at the end of their journey. They realize that this encounter with God was just the beginning. The purpose of their mission wasn't a fancy baby shower. The purpose of their mission is to go on another mission. And they return by another route. I think the entire good news of this story hinges on this phrase, they returned by another route. I mean, think of a time you were on vacation. You felt really grounded and centered. Maybe you were with your family and friends, but you felt connected to just yourself and your source. And you think, when I get home, I want to hold on to this feeling forever. But you get home and things are just the same. Or maybe think of a friend that you lost touch with, and you reconnect and you pick up where you left off. And at the end of the reunion, you say, we need to do this more often, but you don't actually talk again for another 4 or 5 years. Or maybe you volunteered for a cause that opened your eyes. Maybe you went to a Black Lives Matter rally or a Pride parade, and it warmed your heart, but in the end, it was just a parade. And you went home, and that was it. Well, that's not what happens for the Magi. They encounter God and discover that God isn't found in the perfect moments or the nostalgic reunions or the simple solutions. God is found in the vulnerable, tender, and risky places. And suddenly they get it. Their eyes are open to the reality. They see the violent reality of the world, and they go back an entirely different route. Everything is different. So do you have these moments in your story? Maybe you hit a point where you realized, if I want that inner peace I feel on vacation, I do need to work less and spend more time with family. Or maybe you realize that you do need to stay in touch with people who know you, and instead of letting the months tick by, you pick up the phone and make plans to get together. Or maybe you found a cause that touched your heart. I read that Betty White volunteered with animals for like 70 years. I mean, talk about being committed into transformative change. Or maybe there was a moment you decided it was time to come out to yourself or to your family and friends. Maybe there was a moment that you understood that this marriage that once was so good just isn't anymore. Think of a moment that you realized in your own life you weren't living your authentic story, and God gave you a sign that it was time to do things differently. Maybe you referred to it as rock bottom or the end of your rope or a change of heart, but the church calls it Epiphany. These are Epiphany moments. We've talked about this before as Kairos, but this is what we are celebrating today. In Advent, we practice waiting. In Christmas, God arrives, and then in Epiphany, we notice that the signs of God, we notice the signs from God that God is up to something. We encounter God by confronting vulnerability and oppression, and our eyes are open to the reality of the situation. We realize something has to change, something has to be different, and there's more work to do. We're constantly waiting only to realize that the things we waited for send us on a new journey. And that's what this day celebrates. In a world of oppression and violence and injustice and hurt, God shows up in these spaces. And the wisdom that the Magi have to offer is that once we realize God is in the most vulnerable places, the only way to live is to go another way. So let me give you another example. Imagine, if you will, a world in the middle of a pandemic, and they spend most of a year quarantining in isolation. They're told to wait for a vaccine, and everyone believes that the vaccine will be a sign that the pandemic is ending. And then the vaccine comes along, and the people go, and they scramble through websites to find appointments. They wait in lines. It seems that all their prayers have been answered. But beneath the surface, there's a world of power and politics, a whole system of oppression that no one realized. And they start to fear their neighbors. They start to hoard the vaccine for their own country. They get so lost in the data that they aren't even sure what to think anymore. And then this new variant comes along, and suddenly all the rules are different. And it happens again, and it happens again. And the people start to notice that something has to change. Something has to be different. If we are going back to normal, it's going to require that we take a different route. Imagine that. And we know that God is here. God is with us in our realities, in our bodies, in our politics, in our suffering and oppression, in the violence, and in the shit show. God doesn't show up in grand entrances and perfect solutions. God shows up as a baby in an empire that kills babies. And God is here in an empire that isn't sure what to do next. In this pandemic world, we've probably heard the phrase new normal so many times, most of us are probably nauseous from hearing it. But perhaps that's part of what this story offers. Perhaps the way out of political divisiveness and COVID and quarantine fatigue, the way out of fear, the way out of oppression and injustice and anxiety and isolation, the way out is to go a different route. Not to white knuckle our way back into normal, but to realize that things have to change. I mean, if we do go back to the way things were, do we just forget about conversations around racial justice? Do we forget about reparations or working from home? How much we value a hug? How much we miss smiling? Do we forget about the most vulnerable or those spaces where God showed up? If we romanticize the story, we run the risk of missing what God is doing. God is giving people signs in unlikely places, like stars that are only understood by people way outside the system. God is encountered in vulnerable places, like babies born in an empire that kills babies. And God's invitation to us is often to do something totally new and unexpected, like going home by a different route. So as a fair warning, this sermon is kind of the trailer to a trailer. Next Sunday, we're kicking off a sermon series on wisdom. And while we call the Magi wise by nature, I think a case could be made that their wisdom is in their humility. They're humble enough to trust that stars and babies and dreams are places that God speaks. And they're humble enough to relinquish control and try something new and different. So I want to invite you into an exercise. We'll start it today and see where it leads. But in the last few months of 2021, I started noticing the word joy showed up for me in all kinds of places. When I first met my boyfriend, he sent it to me in a text message, and I remember being struck by what an obscure word joy was to use in daily conversation. And then 2 different professors used the word joy with me in feedback on different papers that I wrote, and several of you used the word joy with me when giving me feedback on my sermons, which I appreciated. And then the Joy Week was the week here at Salt House that the Nativity play got canceled, and this sort of gray cloud just descended on Christmas. So this word joy has caught my attention, and I've really been thinking about what joy means in my life right now. So I invite you to think of something that has gotten your attention lately. A star, perhaps, that piqued your interest or rose on your horizon. Perhaps it's a word, or a situation, or a relationship. Maybe it's something that makes you smile, or something that makes you anxious, or something that you just can't get out of your head. I want you to think of this word, whatever it is, and then over by the door on the platform with the Surface Hub, we have some little stars. And during our song, I invite you to come up and write your word on the star. If you can't think of anything, we have an option for you too. On the Surface Hub, there is a word generator, so you can come up and hit the button on the screen, and it'll give you a word to write on your star. And even if it doesn't seem obvious to you now, maybe that word is something you can start to look for to see if that shows up anywhere else. And if you're streaming from home, we have an option for you too. If you know your word, you can put it in the comments on Facebook or YouTube, or we're going to drop the link for this same word generator onto the comments so that you can write your word down too. Then when you get home, put your word someplace that you'll see it. Some horizon where it'll catch your eye. Maybe that's your fridge or your desk or your bedside table. And in the next week or months, or maybe even throughout 2022, I invite you to be vulnerable with your God, to allow God to show up in unexpected places, perhaps speaking to you through this word, or perhaps opening your eyes to some broken reality that needs to be different. And ultimately, I encourage you to have the wisdom to humbly try something new, to return home by a different route, to risk the change that needs to be made. I mean, we all want these romantic tableau stories, those silent nights and such. We want to wait and then be rewarded when we arrive, but that's not how this story goes. And it's not how our story goes either. We have an epic God who does epic things in a very risky and vulnerable way. We must only have the wisdom to go on the journey and to take the risk of being changed. Amen? Amen.